Hello, my name is Dane Parcel, and this is my submission for Module 13 for Supervision and Evaluation. The overall objective of this module was to evaluate and analyze a case study. That case study, titled A Good Teacher Turns Bad, involved two adults at Crestview Elementary. One adult, the principal, Mrs. Jean Wilson, and the other adult, Mrs. Horton, a first grade teacher. Mrs. Horton has been going through some personal issues at home, and as a result of those personal issues, her ability to be an effective teacher is in question. Many adults, including other teachers and parents of students, have shown concern in regards to this behavior. So as I work to identify and analyze the problem, I do look at the facts that were presented to me. So some of the facts presented include Mrs. Wilson being the principal of Crestview Elementary for the past 3 years, and this is actually her 4th year. Previously to that, she was a teacher for 13 years. Mrs. Wilson is a supervisor for 25 staff members, and Crestview Elementary is viewed to be a pretty positive place to be, where attendance is good, test scores are great, and parents are supportive and happy. Crestview Elementary is also piloting a new reading program at this time. Mrs. Horton, a veteran first grade teacher, is also the former Teacher of the Year. She is currently going through some home issues where her husband has moved out and her 2 teenage sons are left under her supervision. Mrs. Horton is not a fan of the reading program being piloted, and even with additional conversations is still not showing positive comments with that. Mrs. Horton's behavior has then led us to the issue and the known facts of the issue. Parents have shown some concern with Mrs. Horton. They have tried to contact her through phone, through letters, and Mrs. Horton has refused to hold their conferences, stating that she is being unprofessional, being late to school, and being verbally abusive to their children. Some of these parents have gone to the Board of Education, and the superintendent has contacted Mrs. Wilson of these concerns. Mrs. Wilson has addressed the situation with the superintendent, stating that she has been in the classroom regularly and is not showing signs of verbal abuse. However, one of the parents still does not feel like enough is being done and came to the school requesting his child to be removed from Mrs. Horton's class. His child, Julie, has expressed these concerns to him, and he wants something done immediately. So as a result, Mrs. Wilson set up a parent-teacher administrator meeting with the 3 of them, but the meeting was unsuccessful as Mrs. Horton was viewed as being unprepared, and after accusations that were pretty harsh from Mr. Stafford, Mrs. Horton shared disgust with him, hitting her fist on the table and calling him a liar. At that time, Mrs. Wilson dismissed Mr. Stafford from the meeting and promised to address the concern with Julie immediately. Some of the facts that I would still like to know before I feel like my plan of action is fully complete will be to know the district's evaluation process, Mrs. Wilson's practice in that process, and Mrs. Horton's most recent evaluations. Mrs. Wilson stated that she had not seen any signs of verbal abuse, but I'm curious as to know what Mrs. Wilson did see in those evaluations and if that behavior was showing signs of ineffectiveness at the time. I'd also like to know the district policies for the unprofessional behavior that has occurred with Mrs. Horton already, being tardy, slamming her fist on the table, calling a parent a liar. What are the policies for that behavior? In addition to that, I'd like to know what Mrs. Wilson's action plan was prior to this event. This seems like it could have been handled or avoided if Mrs. Wilson would have stepped in and showed support to Mrs. Horton immediately knowing when the divorce was occurring. The divorce occurred the year before, the behavior is still occurring. I'm curious to know if Mrs. Wilson provided support in the effect of being just a good person to Mrs. Horton in her efforts to go through a divorce. I'm also interested to know, was a meeting held before Mr. Stafford appeared that day? Mrs. Wilson took the time to plan a meeting for the next day. Did she meet with Mrs. Horton prior to that meeting to discuss what might be conversed in that meeting and to show signs of preparedness? In addition, I'd like to know why Mrs. Horton does not like the reading program. And if that is the case, are other teachers involved in her same feelings? And does the reading program need to continue or be stopped? I'd also like to know if there was student input gathered from Mrs. Wilson. Did she talk to Julie? Did she talk to the other students about the verbal abuse? What is the student data that is being given from the students in Mrs. Horton's classroom? Are there signs that are showing ineffectiveness teaching compared to previous years with Mrs. Horton? And then I'd also like to know some aspects of her home life. I do not feel like I need to know everything, but I feel like if the home life is affecting her school professionally, some things need to be informed. Mrs. Wilson needs to be informed of those things to make the right decisions and be supportive of Mrs. Horton. So identifying the problem, I feel like it's twofold in this manner. Mrs. Horton needs to Mrs. Horton's behavior as a result of her home issues is part of the problem. She is not being professional by not contacting parents. She is also not being professional in the classroom where she is being verbally abusive. On the other hand, Mrs. Horton is not the only one to blame in this situation. Mrs. Wilson needs to take part in this problem as well. Is this an evaluation issue where Mrs. Wilson missed ineffective teaching through her observations because she doesn't know how to do them properly? Is this a supervision issue where Mrs. Wilson should have stepped in a long time ago to address the tardiness, to address the unprofessionalism with her peers? All of these together have led to the boiling point that existed with Mr. Stafford. Category 2 then is to create a plan of action, and my overall goal was to work with both parties and the problem to come up with a plan of action and implement that. So since the meeting was held in the morning, I would encourage some type of reflection time by Mrs. Horton and Mrs. Wilson prior to having a meeting set up between the two of them to address the situation. I would encourage that meeting to be held at the end of the day or the next morning, but held as soon as possible. Mrs. Horton may also need some time to herself to come to a better supportive stance that day to be able to teach her students. That meeting happened in the morning. Is she going to be effective the rest of the day? So something needs to be addressed with that effect. Prior to the meeting that should be held between Mrs. Horton and Mrs. Wilson should consult the district level leaders and the Board of Education policies. And she also needs to come with a plan of improvement for Mrs. Horton. But that plan should not be made 100% final until she meets with Mrs. Horton. Mrs. Horton needs to accept the plan of improvement, which I believe should have additional observations, should have multiple checkpoints and goal setting. It should also have professional support for Mrs. Horton. That professional support may be in the form of a counselor or a social work to be able to identify and help Mrs. Horton with strategies that will help her figure out how to cope with going through a divorce. In that meeting, I also believe Mrs. Wilson needs to require Mrs. Horton to apologize to Mr. Stafford. I believe she needs to also provide Mrs. Horton a timeline for her to address the parent concerns of the other parents in the classroom. And there needs to be team building activities within the school to build a relationship back with Mrs. Horton and the other teachers. One idea would also be to reach out to one teacher in particular or two teachers that can be supportive to Mrs. Horton and step in and just see how she's doing that day. Mrs. Wilson needs to address the reading pilot to see if the reading program is causing stress with other teachers. She needs to also address the other parent's concern. I think that can be done with Mrs. Horton in play, but she needs to make sure it's addressed. Mrs. Wilson needs to also have additional observations and reflect on her interactions with the other teachers. And is her reactions and interactions with the other teachers positive and supportive to them as well? So in category 3, when I'm resolving the issues, what's best for students, I think one of the first things we need to deal with is we need to resolve the issue with Mr. Stafford immediately. We need to decide whether to move or not to move Julie in this situation. I fear that the parent-teacher-student relationship has been broken and ruined, and I'm not sure how effective it could be put back in place. Ultimately, I'm not sure how Mrs. Horton would be open to having Julie in the classroom anymore. I don't feel like that's a good enough reason to not keep her there, but the issue needs to be resolved. I think the issue with the other parents needs to also be resolved so that those adults know that the concern is being addressed. And then Mrs. Wilson needs to support Mrs. Horton in her efforts to improve. That's through goal setting, additional step-ins, professional development, and the walkthroughs. I think with those 3 bulleted items and then the other ones, we're looking at what's best for students and promoting success for all. As I researched this module, there were some things that I was thinking, feeling, and valuing throughout the process. So as I was reading it, I was thinking, why is this just on Mrs. Horton? This is not just her fault. Why was this not addressed earlier? Why was Mrs. Wilson not more proactive in the nature? And then will Mrs. Horton be open to the change if necessary? Or will she need to be looked at released? So I was feeling empathy for Mrs. Horton because I know it's hard to break apart the home and the school life, but I know it's necessary at times. And I was also concerned about how am I going to handle this if it really did happen to me. I still value all the parent interactions that were being done and the fact that they were being supportive of their children and supportive to show concern towards the teacher. And I also value Mrs. Horton as a teacher. She was the previous teacher of the year, so she obviously has some effective skills and an effective nature to her. She just needs to get back into that place. And then overall, I'm just wondering, will my plan of action really resolve the issues? So in my standard 2 reflection, component 1, I believe that increasing the number of observations, providing Mrs. Horton training and professional development, and evaluating the reading pilot will all promote the academic success of the students by enhancing Mrs. Horton's instructional capacity. These all will come into play in making Mrs. Horton a better teacher. In regards to helping the students' self and their well-being, I believe by talking with the students in Mrs. Horton's class to show that you are concerned with them. I also believe that addressing the issues with the specific parents and their children will build a better parent-teacher-student relationship by all involved. And creating team-building activities will help build a positive school culture. I think all 3 of those things will help the well-being of a child. How does the building leader enhance instructional capacity? I think that can be done through the collaboration time to develop a plan of action, requiring Mrs. Horton to create goals and to work towards meeting them, building a better teacher-leader relationship, and then overall having increased expectations for Mrs. Horton.